Well, thank you all for coming. This is my last lecture. People have been saying, haven't you got any audio visual? And in fact, I did have some, but it didn't work. But fortunately, my friend, when I was in the field, my friend Tina visited, and she took some footage, and last night she sort of did a rough cut. So you'll see about I'll start off with just 5 minutes of footage. The first few minutes are about you'll see the women singing, but not very well, and then they have a mango wedding, which is relevant for today, and you'll see just the one symbol of the mango. And then we cut to another place where you'll see a different style of singing, and you'll notice a difference in the tempo of the beat, and you'll see the singers a bit better. So we'll just start off with that, and then we'll get on to the lecture proper. So we can just see the pictures, and I'll start talking. But basically here what she's doing now is preparing the sacred place for the wedding. It's called the Mando, and and here is, she's welcoming the groom. Here is in this wedding there's only one person. One person gets married, which is part of what I'm going to talk about today. And this is the ritual welcome. And maybe you can come here and you move it on a bit. This is from a village I'm not familiar with, so I don't know who these people are.
Next cut is the wedding. Here.
The wedding. Here's the wedding there now, yeah. Yeah. So anyway, we'll just keep going on, move it forward. And then women fall into trances, and they get possessed. And okay, keep going. And there, we see the thing. Keep going to the next one. Click up about here. So, yeah, this you can see how they play their there's a strumming on the top, and there's sort of a beat. This is sort of the original musical bow, and there's a resonating chamber underneath, and it's in the musical terms it's called the primitive bow. Okay, let's finish that now. I'm sorry about that, but this is why I never have high-tech stuff in my lectures, because it never works. Okay, I'm back to the
presentation.
So presentation, thanks. There we are. Okay, here we are. Great. Okay. I began my lectures by situating my work on the sacred poetry and rituals of the Guru Mai's of Bastar in the context of two general mythic themes that Jensen and Frobenius identified. The Hanueli myth found among root crop cultivators that tell of gods that are beheaded, and the Prometheus myth found among cereal cultivators that tell of theft and abduction of wives. Jensen's primary aim was to understand sacrifice rituals, and he argued that if we are to understand them, we must, quote, uncover the initiating creative forces. He notes that sacrifice rituals are a feature of cereal crop cultures, but he finds the source of the idea to be in root crop cultivators. This leads him to argue that the understanding of sacrifice ritual requires a study of the cultural history of agrarian transition from root crop cultivation to cereal cultivation. I raise the important question to put it aside because I want to address another question that Jensen's theory poses. If sacrifice rituals and myths about beheadings have their initial creative source in cultures based on root crop cultivation, then what ritual has its creative source in cereal crop cultivators, which tell of myths, where the myths tell of theft and abduction? I should say, too, that it seems to be a requirement of directors of this institute to be experts in sacrifice, and this whole lecture will have to be rewritten in a few months when Professor Hardenberg's new book out on sacrifice comes out. It's a wonderful ethnographic investigation which pulls apart all these speculative general theories, which of course is another reason I'm not talking about sacrifice. So what we've seen then is, so far we've looked at cereals and we've looked at rice and millets and we've looked at the myths, and today then we come to the rituals. My claim is that the wedding ritual, is the key ritual in cereal societies, or at least in Bastar. And that the culture-specific marker of this is the goddess Lakshmi, adorned as a bride in gold jewellery. And this brings together this image of Lakshmi associated with gold. Weddings in India show an extraordinary variation by region, by class and by caste. But the common theme is the idea that the bride becomes the golden Lakshmi on her wedding day and is afforded the respect of a divine queen during the ritual. The wedding then is a religious ritual with great social, familial and economic implications. And my aim here is to examine some of these by exploring the cultural specificities of the Bastar wedding. Wedding rituals and sacrifice rituals are both found in Bastar. In fact, they are two of the most important rituals. They constitute the core of a religious life of Bastar. But, unlike where Roland works, the religious division of labour is stark. Whereas the performance of the Lakshmi Jagar epic is a story about women by women, and mostly for women, but not exclusively so, sacrifice rituals are strictly male-only affairs. But of course, women can participate as observers. Furthermore, whereas the Guru Mais sing about the great gods and goddesses of the Hindu pantheon and plead with them to come and dwell in their houses, the spirit mediums in sacrifice rituals are possessed by the local ancestral spirits. Finally, whereas the Lakshmi Jagar epic is a ritual enactment of a 31,000-line sacred poem, the sacrifice rituals men perform are not structural enactments of a myth. Indeed, I have found that men know very few myths, and when they do, they are never talked about publicly. Sacrifice rituals can be performed any time, but the wedding season is fixed. The symbolic weddings of rice, mango and water are held in the cold season, and the actual weddings of people are in the hot season. So 2/3 of the year, the people are attending either symbolic weddings or actual weddings. You get sick of weddings. Why they don't get sick of them? I'll tell you, I know why they don't get sick of them, we'll see today. Note too that the astrologer has a key role to play in the wedding rituals, but not in the others. And this is because rituals must be held on auspicious days, at auspicious times. And indeed, as I've been saying, weddings are all about auspiciousness as a value, and Lakshmi epitomises this key value. Now, when we come, an interesting fact about Indian languages is that unlike German and English, they do not have a word to make the distinction between, they don't have separate words for wedding and marriage. They can, of course, make the distinction, but this is done using a modification of the word for wedding. So when speaking of a married woman, for example, they will say that her wedding has happened. Bihau is the word for wedding. Holi has happened. So the wedding has happened. The only only Indian language I know that has a distinction between wedding and marriage is Fiji Hindi, where I lived for 4 years. And this is because the British authorities demanded that the Indian indentured labourers registered their marriages in the court. And they coined a new word, a new Hindi word was marit karna. In other words, literally marit from marriage, doing marriage, or being married. And so marriage then refers to the legal status of a couple, but wedding refers to the ritual process. It is a religious event, and as the German word nicely so accurately captures. Now, this distinction, I want to argue, is of great theoretical consequence because it matters where we put the focus of our analytical attention. Of course, we've got to look at both weddings and marriage, but British social anthropology focuses on the marriage and write books with titles like Kinship and Marriage, but never with titles like Kinship and Wedding. And French structuralists too are into alliances to the exclusion of weddings. Weddings then are really all about transformations, about the metamorphosis of a female from a state of maidenhood to a state of wifehood. And Hindus, like the German philosophers and poets, find it useful to use the imagery of the life cycle of a plant when talking about this dialectical process. Hindu thought is dialectical in the German sense, not functional in the British sense. And indeed, a Brahmin friend of mine was certain that Hegel must have been a Brahmin in a previous incarnation. As proof, he cites a passage from Hegel's Science of Logic. And this is difficult in English, but the idea is simple. The popular, especially Oriental proverbs, that all that exists has the germ of death in its very birth, that death, on the other hand, is the entrance of a new life, expresses at bottom the same union of being and nothing. It's a simple way of saying death is birth, birth is death, and this idea, we'll see, is elaborated in great detail in this metamorphosis of Lakshmi. So the central theme of my lectures then has been the metamorphosis of Lakshmi, from conception to fetus, to birth, to girl, and finally to bride, the focus of my lectures today. And we have seen that the women poets of Bastar imagine this metamorphosis by constructing an epic tale using plant and animal images drawn from everyday life. And each image we have seen has served to develop a conception of wealth whose underlying values inform the thoughts and actions of people in their quest for wealth and happiness. Whereas the symbol of the lotus is used to talk about wealth in the form of progeny, and the symbol of Weiss is used to talk about wealth in the form of food and other material necessities of life, Lakshmi as bride raises the question of wealth in the form of fame and status and gold. So we saw then we have those four conceptions: progeny, material wealth, fame, lotus and daughters, rice and material wealth, and now I'm saying the bride raises this question of fame. Lakshmi is every woman, and every woman is a daughter goddess. When a girl is born, Hindus often say Lakshmi is born. While many parents may not be happy that a girl rather than a boy is born, the situation is different at the daughter's wedding. On this day, a daughter assumes a supreme form of wealth, bedecked in gold, and given away in lavish ceremonies that bring fame to the parents as hosts, enable guests to renew ties of friendship and kinship, and transform the bride from virgin maiden into wife. And I use the word virgin maiden deliberately because in North India, a bride is reckoned to be the supreme form of the gift, the kanyadan, literally the gift of a virgin maiden. She's not called so in Bastar for reasons, significant reasons we'll see later on. To grasp the significance of the idea of Lakshmi as bride and as a supreme form of wealth, it is necessary to consider 3 points of view on the wedding: the host of the wedding, as the guests at the wedding, and the bride. It is not necessary to consider the groom because he is an optional extra at the Hindu wedding. So we can forget about men, we'll see they're not necessary, which raises the question of what is a Hindu wedding or a Bastar wedding. As in the ancient Roman wedding, it's not only in Bastar, as in the ancient Roman wedding, you don't need a groom to get married in Bastar. I will now consider these 3 points of view in turn. My concern, as always, is with the cultural specificity of the Bastar case and with the generalities that the specifics suggest. Now, the quest for fame is a human failing of great generality, one that affects us all, both men and women. Indeed, the actions of women, characters in the Lakshmi Jagar epic, is motivated by the desire for fame. And a recurrent refrain in the epic is the following: "O Bhagwan, what should I do? O parents, what should I do? Curse my luck, curse my fate. I have no name, I have no fame. I will die without a name." And so this desire for fame motivates all the narrative action in the epic. The quest for fame, then, is a general one. We achieve it by having our name remembered. The living do this by ranking the names of the dead and hoping that they too will join them someday. The more ancient the ancestor, the higher the fame, as in Goethe, Frobenius and Jensen. Best too, if the names of the ancestors can be attached to bricks and mortar, as in Goethe, who has a university named after him, and Frobenius, who has an institute that currently takes up 2 floors. Jensen is yet to be immortalised in bricks and mortar, but hopefully someday he will get his building. Hopefully too, the Jensen lectures will have the rooms of this building named after him, so our names will live forever. So, in India, the father, I'll have 3 points. I want to look at the fame for the hosts, friendship as a desire of the guest, and the ritual state of the daughter. Now, in India, the father of the bride achieves fame by adorning his daughter with as much gold as he can afford and bathing in the reflected glory of the celebration that imitates the actions of kings. Such as this case here in 2017 wedding in South India. The bride wore £400 worth of jewellery, and her father flaunted his wealth with a collection of change and armbands, which is she's wearing about 13 kg of gold around her neck. And so it's obvious then the burden of fame is a heavy one. As it is for the rich, so it is for the poor. And this is the daughter of my son. He's daughter of my good friend in Bastar. And this man is one of Bastar's most famous tribal artists, and he's achieved fame. And she was the first in her caste to wear such a necklace, even though it only weighs 44 grams and costs 1,500 British pounds, a fortune by local standards. But the average weight of necklaces worn by the upper middle classes in India is around 200 to 300 grams, with a value of up around £10,000, which is about €11,000. Now, the idea of Lakshmi as a bride adorned in gold is an ancient one which goes back 3,000 years, as this Sanskrit epic shows. "Draw into me, O sacred fire, O Agni, O sacred fire, the goddess Lakshmi, the resplendent, the golden, dough-like, moon-lustrous, garlanded in silver and gold." There's a sense in which the modern Indian wedding is a ritual enactment of this ancient hymn. Gold is always associated with Lakshmi, but it is not her essence. It's an adornment, it's an adjunct. And we've seen that the lotus is the primordial symbol of her essence, and which symbolises her wealth as a daughter. Nevertheless, this religious association has profound economic consequences. India, along with China, has been one of the largest importers of gold in the world. Both are infamous in economic circles as, quote, the sink of the precious metals. In 1913, John Maynard Keynes, British's most famous economist, declared, "If a time comes when the Indians learn to leave off their," I'm quoting, "unfertile habits and to divert their hordes into the channels of productive industry and to the enrichments of the field, they will have the money markets of the world at their mercy." That was 100 years ago. A century later, the Indians have not given up their infertile habits. To the contrary, they continue to hoard at an ever extreme increasing rate. Current estimates reckon that about 22,000 tonnes of gold are in private hands in India, collectively worth over half the size of the national economy. This is twice the size of the official holdings in the Bank of England. So absolutely extraordinary amount of gold, which the current Prime Minister is trying to mobilise. Now, imports of gold into India have risen sharply since the Indian government's neoliberal revolution in 1991. But any attempt to understand these developments in purely economic terms is bound to fail. There has been a huge investment in what we might call Lakshmi spiritual capital, as this temple here in South India, the Siri Puram Golden Temple, built in 2007, illustrates. It sits on 100 acres of land in Tamil Nadu. It was covered with 1.5 tonnes of pure gold, worth over 65 million. It's just so my point is, Lakshmi and gold are related. Now, there is the pursuit of fame, the pursuit of wealth as fame has a number of paradoxes. This is because an increase in wealth in this form is often attained at the expense of a decrease in wealth in other forms, such as material wealth and progeny. The battle for prestige among fathers means that dowries get ever bigger at wedding receptions, and wedding receptions get ever more expensive as fathers compete for status and prestige. And the price of this wealth, wealth as fame, is often lifelong debt and misery. And studies reveal that the greatest cause of rural indebtedness in India is the wedding. People just borrow, well, we'll see how much they borrow. And in India, North India, where the ideology of Kanyadan is most highly developed, the rising size of dowries is one of the reasons that girl babies are devalued relative to boys relative to other parts of India. An upwardly mobile father whose wife produces daughters only faces a life of ruin. So there are many. Another paradox about the pursuit of wealth as fame is that a major motivation for the poor is not so much the pursuit of fame, but the avoidance of shame. When I asked a low-ranked public servant why he spent so much money on his daughter's wedding, he replied, "If I don't have a big wedding for my daughter, people will laugh at me." And there are many different ways to get married in Bastar, and the Lakshmi as bride model is the most precious ideal. And when I asked how much a wedding cost, I was told, "Jitro paisarele uttara karcha." As much money as you have, that much money it will cost. In other words, people spend everything. Now, unlike in other parts of India, widow remarriages is acceptable in Bastar, and this is celebrated with very little ceremony and is a very cheap option. Another possibility is bride service, a variation on the worldwide practice that involves the sons of the poor spending a number of years working for the father of the bride prior to the wedding. When the wedding eventually takes place, the bride father foots the entire bill. A groom of this kind is called a lamsena, and the very mention of the word brings back mirth and laughter. So people ridicule people who have been born by this way. But the cheapest option is simply to skip the wedding and cohabit, a popular strategy in Europe. This option is that many poor people have no choice but to adopt. This has zero money cost, but extremely high moral cost, especially for women, as the name of this type of union, the English word naughty girl marriage, suggests. Logically speaking, the union is also a naughty boy marriage, but the universal sexist law of the double standard rules that out. If we look at naughty girl marriages in Bastar, I've done some statistics. This table here provides some data on the prevalences of marriage among the poor and the poorest of the poor. It can be seen that they were highest among the poorest of the poor. all of whom were landless labourers, and they counted for some 57% of all marriages. Among the relatively better off residents, only 33%. So we can see as you get better off, the number of naughty girl marriages is declining, which establishes a correlation between wealth and the ideal marriage that carries right on to the rest of society in India. I don't know of one single naughty girl marriage among the rich in Bastar. and it is true that love marriages occur among the elite, but these are opposed to arranged marriages rather than naughty girl marriages. Arranged marriages still account for the majority of marriages in India today. And when a son or a daughter insist on marrying someone they love, a crisis inevitably ensues. Such was the case with the son of my collaborator in this Lakshmi Jagar epic. His father was trying to find a wife for his son. He spent years and he'd always reject this person. Eventually he told her he was in love with a gone girl from a different caste, and that caused enormous eruptions. And so he, when his son insisted on marrying this girl, his parents reluctantly agreed, and they held a wedding ceremony of the classic Lakshmi Jagar, the golden wedding type, very expensive one. But there were moral costs. The bride's family outcasted her, and some of my collaborators' siblings broke off relationships with him. So there's a big chance the social costs of going against the rules are very high. So the naughty girl marriages of Bastar then are at one extreme. At the other extreme, we have the weddings of the super rich. And this here is a newspaper report of one in 2004. An Indian steel tycoon paid $60 million for his daughter's wedding, a 6-day bash of 1,500 guests in France's in the Versailles. And this wasn't enough, apparently. He had a makeshift castle built in a park at St. Claude outside the capital. And interestingly, Mittal was named in Ford magazines as one of the richest people in the world, and his marriage cost more than the recent royal marriage in Spain at the time. I find this Forbes list of the richest people in the world really fascinating reading, because it's bogus, of course. What it's telling us is fame, and people want to get in that list, and Donald Trump was very upset that he never made that list of the top 10 billionaires. So I now come to the second point I want to make. In other words, look at weddings from the point of view of the guests. Weddings confront all parents with a dilemma. As hosts of the wedding of their children, parents complain bitterly about the costs and the obligations they are under to provide gifts and accommodation for so many people. But when they're as guests of a wedding of the children of their friends, they are staunch supporters of the wedding, because it gives them a chance to eat, drink, and to be merry for days on end at someone else's expense. Guests then love weddings. They are their chief defenders. So weddings everywhere have a threefold function: to provide hospitality, to reproduce friends, and to also transform the status of the bride. All are equally important socially, but they have radically different economic costs. As this table here shows, this is a public servant's wedding. We can see that 52% of the cost of the wedding was for hospitality. 45% was for dowry, kitchens, jewellery, and so on. And only 3% was for the costs for the actual wedding, for the priest and the religious paraphernalia. So my point then is that a lot of people enjoy what's going on. It's good fun. And so we tend, when we talk about ritual, we tend to forget that in economic terms, the ritual activity is very of minor importance, but obviously crucial importance in cultural terms. Another cost of a wedding is time. and as someone who has spent unbelievable amounts of time bored out of my brain waiting for things to happen at a wedding, anthropologists have a tough time working on rituals. I decided one day to do a time and motion study of a ritual, and the Bastar wedding is incredibly complex. It has 56 different rituals which go over, in one sense, many, many years. But the last ritual is called Puri Kachani, and it is where they it involves the ritual washing of the turmeric-stained wedding clothes used by the bride and groom during a crucial stage of the wedding. And the anointment stage, we'll come back to that. So I decided I found that wedding, that ritual, just took 6 minutes. but we spent that took 6 minutes held at the bride's family. And during that day at the bride's family, we spent 3 hours waiting and then 2 hours eating and drinking, 5 hours all day. Then the next day, the groom says, we must come down to my place. So we spend 2.5 hours driving, 6 hours waiting, and 2.5 hours eating and drinking. So 1% of the time on the wedding ritual, and 15% on there, 56% of the time waiting, and 20% eating and drinking. So never let anyone tell you the greatest quality an anthropologist should have is patience. And there's the proof. So, but it's good fun. Sitting around is all worth it, the conviviality is wonderful, and this is really what participant observation is all about. And indeed, this is where serendipity as a research process happens. You come there, you're sitting drinking, and you find out all sorts of things you didn't expect to discover as you're sitting here, shooting the breeze, as we say in Australia. But you notice there's again a sexual division of labour. You get women and mothers and kids over here, and the boys separately. Notice our fancy cars had 4-wheel drives. We had to hire to go down. So, I now come to the third point, the Lakshmi as bride. And here, economically, as we've seen, it's trivial in the sense of time, relatively speaking, and trivial in terms of the cost, but of profound importance culturally. And so we've considered the fame the wedding brings to the father, and secondly, how it enables friends to renew friendships. I now come to my third point, the bride's perspective and the ritual transformation in her status that the wedding comes about. As I said, in economic forms, it's trivial, but in cultural terms, this is absolutely, they could not be higher. Now, the 56 rituals that constitute a wedding, as I said, could not be more complicated, but the fundamental idea that informs the whole process is a very simple one, a very wide generality. And the best way to understand this point is to ask, why is the groom an optional extra at the Bastar wedding? Why was it also the case in the ancient Roman weddings, and what is the generality of this custom? Now, the word for wedding in Bastar is bihau, which has many levels of meaning. There's at least 3. Oops, sorry, my diacritics didn't come out. This is your problem with your machine. No, I'm joking. Sorry, anyway, it doesn't matter. At its most general level, it includes the betrothal or the engagement rituals and the wedding rituals proper. In 1980, when I first went to Bastar, so-called child marriage, which was the norm. A girl was betrothed when she was 3 or 4 years old, and the betrothal rituals consisted, ideally, of 7 distinct rituals spread out over about 10 years. At the last betrothal ritual, a date was set for the girl's pre-puberty wedding. This was a 7-day event and was the wedding proper, and that was held with great... It also included all the most important rituals of eating, feasting, drinking and dancing. The groom was an optional extra at these events. When a prospective partner could not be found for the young girl, the ritual was called a Kandabara, which was I can't see the, oh yeah, there it is, don't worry about it. So the Kandabara, it says Kandabara there. That's basically a pre-wedding ritual, pre-puberty wedding ritual without the groom. And then, so if you did have the groom, the same wedding would take place, whether the groom was there or not. And sometimes you might put a clay pot or something representing the groom. And then you'd have a post-puberty cohabitation ritual. So there's a sense in which they weren't child marriages because they lived together after post-puberty, but the idea of child marriage, of course, excites a lot of strong emotion. But the most expensive part then was this one here. This is a very trivial wedding. This one used to be incredibly expensive as well. Now, these have changed greatly over times, and the best way to do this is to look at I've got two cases here, and the case of Janie, who was born in 1966, and her daughter, Dioki, who was born in 1993. Now, Janie was betrothed to her cross-cousin when she was 9, and they had her first betrothal ritual when she was 9. Then 3 years later, they spent 3 years with betrothal rituals, probably 6 or 7. 7 is the ideal number, and of course sometimes they vary. So, and then the wedding happened when she turned 13, and that was the full 7-day ritual, but she then cohabited after her menses came when she turned 14, and but her groom was a few years older, as you can see. So that was the case when I first went there in 1980. Today, we see here with her daughter, she had her Kandabara puberty no groom wedding when she was 10. And then we see in 2013, over the period of 5 months, she had all the wedding rituals. So everything is now, nothing's changed, it's all compressed. And so instead of being spread out over 20 years, it's now, in this case, spread out over this very short period of time. And also shortened down to 4 days. So they use the word shortcut. So, but the shortcut has been associated then with this rapid escalation in the costs. And it's totally out of control, in fact. And I think the wedding industry in India, I would reckon, is by far the biggest economic industry. It's just unbelievable. And anyway, so then I think this case, what this case draws attention to is the ritual significance of the Kandabara no-groom wedding. And this is my point. Weddings in Bastar are initiation rituals that mark a stage in the life cycle of a daughter and also of a man. They are quite distinct from marriage, which defines a legal state. So all of these different rituals are, and here we have to go back to the beginning to Goethe, because they're making this association here with the rice plants. As we saw in lecture 3, Lakshmi is rice personified. Lakshmi's life cycle is every daughter's life cycle. Just as the rice germinates from a seed, grows a stem, which sprouts leaves, then flowers, then fruits that is harvested to produce a seed, so that the process can be begun again, so the daughter begins life as a fetus in her mother's womb, is born, grows up as a child, reaches maturity, is married, becomes a wife, dies, and is reborn. In India, you're reborn as your granddaughter, so that the process can be begun again. Just as Goethe said everything is a leaf, I would argue that everything is a wedding in these rituals. All rituals have the same basic structure. The 3 key rituals here are birth, which is death, as we saw a few weeks ago, the birth and the eating of the mother Muttakukkan. The wedding and the death. And the death ritual, interestingly, is called the final wedding. So even in the language of the people, they're equating all of these rituals on the same thing. The birth is a death, the death is a wedding, and so on. So this, what we have here is this form is the three key ritual processes and three key ritual states that Lakshmi, as a daughter goddess, goes through in Guru Maya's epic tale. First comes the conception ritual, which we'll come back to in a minute. The rituals are in red. Here's your ritual, and here's your status. Then the where am I? First comes the First comes the conception ritual, which leads to pregnancy. Then comes the birth ritual, which leads to girlhood. Finally comes the wedding ritual, which leads to wifehood. And the tale ends here because Lakshmi, as a daughter goddess, is not a mother goddess, and she dies like Persephone and is reborn. Now, the key thing about the three red ritual processes is that they all involve holy oil, which is a mixture of turmeric and oil that has been given by the gods. And the key symbols in Bastar that tell the tale of this anointing, as we have seen, is the conception reel is really the marriage of the Wango, which we saw in that ritual. The birth ritual is really the death of the placenta, and they draw the analogy there with the Lotus. And of course, the wedding ritual is again the anointing of the bride. So the three key steps in the Bastar wedding ritual then are, in their language, Nando, Tel and Lugin. And this Tel or anointing, I want to argue, is the absolute key one. The Mando means the sacred place, the canopy. So you set up the sacred place, you have this oil anointing ritual, and you have Lugin, which literally means tying, but it means severance and tying. So this oil anointing ritual is the absolute key. And let's see what happens. And we see that the holy anointing ritual lasts all day, and they have one day for each of these, and precedes the tying ritual. Relatives of the friends of the bride smear them with oil and turmeric mixture in their villages. The procedure is the same in the villages, both for the husband and wife, bride and groom, but for ease of exposition, I'll just restrict myself to the bride. First, the holy oil is collected from a nearby temple, and the parents of the bride begin by anointing the oil in an upward direction. Absolutely crucial. You start at the knees and you anoint upwards. And yes, the relatives and friends follow the same procedure. This ritual is the most sacred of all, but paradoxically, it's conducted with a lot of merriment and joy. People in joking relationships get coloured turmeric water and splash it over each other. So people are having a great time, but only those related as joking relatives. So we can see the wedding is bringing together all sorts of people of different relationships. And the next morning is a very solemn ritual, which is called the anointing downwards ritual, and that brings it to an end. And so, and there's no laughing and joking, this is a very serious, and this marks the end, and the turmeric clothes are put aside for the last 56 ritual. But this anointing ritual is the ritual that marks the end of one ritual state and the beginning of the new. And the holy oil elevates the initiate to a divine status. In this case, when you anoint upwards, she's becoming Lakshmi. When you anoint downwards, she's a woman again. So it's a classic move. So this creates a divine status of the bride, which is ended with a downward anointing on the next day. Rituals of this kind are of great generality, as this example of the coronation of Queen Elizabeth of England. And as I said, as an ardent Republican, I'm very ashamed to admit that she's also the Queen of Australia. But the English word used to describe this as coronation is something of a misnomer because it lays stress on the placing of the crown on her head. The crown, of course, is one of the best known of the crown jewels. It symbolises the wealth of the royal family and it is the most spectacular material form of wealth. But from a ritual point of view, the most valuable object is the ampulla. And I should say it's not the ampulla, but the sacred oil inside the ampulla. And this oil is used to anoint the Queen in the most important ritual of all. And you can download this on Google if you don't, on YouTube, and you can see the ritual. But this ritual is sacred, and it's edited out. And this much is clear, as I said, from this documentary film, which is available on YouTube. Notice the Queen is dressed in a plain white dress, not unlike in India. And next she is hidden behind this canopy, and then there's a cut for about 10 minutes, and then she emerges miraculously wearing a golden gown. And so what is this holy oil? And needless to say, they've got a similar myth to the one we have in Bastar. It comes from the gods. And indeed, the myth of this is a delightful one because it shows there's a bit of prestige and status between the kings of England and the kings of France. So the kings of France had this holy oil first, and then so the kings of England had to get one. And I'll just quote you from a historian. The French began to anoint their kings with oil held to have been originally sent from heaven but for the baptism of Clovis in 508. And they similarly ignored all later papal efforts to restrict them to ordinary oil. The English envy of this miraculous oil of the French and a desire to have their own theocratic state finally provoked the discovery of an equally miraculous heaven-sent oil for the English kings, known as the holy oil of Thomas a Becket, to whom Virgin Mary originally committed, as first recorded in 1318. So it seems to me the only difference between the anointing of the bride in Bastar and the anointing the Queen, as I can see, is that the Queen is no downward anointing. She's anointed up and she stays divine, theoretically or ideologically. And the other thing, of course, is that this holy oil in the ampulla is not mixed with turmeric, which, of course, is the supreme symbol, material symbol of status, of auspiciousness. And it's because this auspicious substance is used in all rituals that everything is a wedding. For example, in Bastar, the funeral is called the final wedding. And when I said, why is it called the final wedding? And then my friend, because what happens, the corpse is rubbed with oil and turmeric. And this contrasts with other parts of India where sandalwood is used. And so sandalwood is used at death. And according to the myth, they said, because sandalwood, turmeric should only be used for weddings, but here it's used for everything, and there's a myth where sandalwood and turmeric had a quarrel. I am best, said the sandalwood, which is the basis for produces the incense. No, I'm not, said the turmeric, and they had a quarrel about each other. The people listening decided that turmeric was number one, and for this reason, turmeric is now used from birth until death. That myth probably had the same status as the English one, but there you go. So, and we also find, it's also fine that it's used for newborn babies after the placenta is delivered and the midwife acting in her capacity as a priestess. I now come to the second part of the ritual, the severance and tying rituals. This is the optional extra part of the wedding. And the most important part is the anointing of the whole oil, which marks a person as or thing to be wedded, be it groom, mango tree, clay pot or whatever. And so all these weddings are the same. So the effect of this wedding is to create the marriage state, the union. The anointing makes people wedded or married, but there's no union. And so we get back to our distinction between wedding and marriage, and there's a sense in which the distinction between wedding and marriage is enacted out here, the ritual process, and the consequence of that is the union. So the birth ritual then severs the relationship between mother and daughter as fetus, and we saw that in the lecture on the whole birth rituals, the midwife engages in, sever that link and create this one here between father and daughter. And in Bastar, at birth, she becomes a member of her father's brotherhood, darabai, literally brotherhood. Then the next ritual then severs that relationship between father and daughter and creates new ones, in Lakshmi's case here, between wifehood. She becomes, as Rice, she becomes the second wife of Lakshmi, her first wife being Alakshmi, goddess of poverty and misery. So for the women of Bastar, wifehood is not a very happy state. And so the marital bonds created by a wedding vary greatly across India, as we saw in last wedding. And in northern India, the Brahmanical values have permeated into relations between families and created a hierarchical relationship between the giver, the brother as giver of bride, and brother as receiver. So you cannot, and you must give your sister in an upward direction to someone of higher status. In other words, in English we say it's better to receive and to give, but in here they say it's better to, that's why they're around, better to give, what do we say in English? It's better to, what do we say? It's better to give than to receive. Here it's the other way around. So, but in Bastar, they stress reciprocity and equality, and they deny this idea that she is Kanyadan, because the very word Kanyadan suggests its Brahmanical values, and so and the Brahmanical values, and they perceive this as a form of theft on the part of greedy wife givers, and they emphasise the egalitarian values that Lakshmi personifies. And their marriages are based on the idea that brothers give sisters away in marriage so that their sons may receive the sister's daughter as a bride in return. In other words, that equality between givers and receivers is achieved over 2 generations. Anthropologists have a jargon term, patrilineal cross-cousin marriage, which scares all students off studying kinship, which is fascinating and destroys all the wonder and excitement. Anyway, the denial of the Brahmanical ideology of Kanyadan means that the ideology of equality permeates the relationship between kin united by marriage. And equality is ritually enacted out at weddings. One ritual is called Sandhi Bent. When the groom's party arrives for the tying ritual, the bride is, and they're ritually welcome in this ritual. In North India, the father of the bride has to touch the feet of the father of the groom as a sign of his inferior status. But this ritual, which goes on for 15 minutes, establishes their absolute equality, as if to say, those guys up there do it that way, we don't, we're into equality. And so what happens, if I'm the father of the bride, I'll wash his feet, he washes mine, and we both drink the water that we washed ourselves. Then I put a flower behind his hair, he puts a flower behind mine, and we give each other a comb, and so on. And so there's equality is sort of enacted out. And the mothers do the same. And there are many other rituals that define kinship relations at weddings. And so, for example, prior to a wedding, my wife, my elder brother and I would be in a joking relationship with my wife. A joking relationship means marriageable, I can flirt and carry on. This has to be changed. So after this joking relationship between my elder brother and my wife has to be turned into its opposite. And so they have all of these rituals are really redefining all these kinship relationships. So it's interesting, notwithstanding this ideology, there's a whole lot of rituals that are performed that no one quite really understands, but some of them clearly enact out this theme of abduction that Jensen and Frobenius rightly thought. When the groom first arrives, he's riding on an elephant or a horse or on the shoulder of someone else, and he has a knife and he hits the wedding thing. They have a mock battle, and he wins it by hitting the sword with the thing. So clearly the idea of conquest is there. At the end of the wedding, the groom symbolically kills a deer and grabs his wife and runs away with her. So we have this idea of bride capture, which is incredibly important. So, just as we've forgotten that the birthday cake is the annual ritual of the consumption of the placenta, so the Bastar people have forgotten the origins of many of their rituals. And most people are totally confused by the 56 rituals. The people who are most confused, of course, are the bride and groom. When I asked a bride and a groom once why he's performing a ritual, "I've got no idea," he said. "I'm just doing what the elders told me to do." Which raises a serious question of how much the elders really know what's going on either. I think there's a lot of negotiation on rituals, and we anthropologists like to think that we're experts on these matters, and we have the analytical tools to decode the cultural hieroglyphics of these rituals. But I think we need to practice a bit more humility. We can't, some of these things are beyond understanding. Let me now contradict myself and conclude with a less than humble restatement of my general thesis. Just as Jensen rightly argues that food not only fills our bellies, it also provides food for imaginative thought, and just as Jensen argues that rituals have their initiating forces in the cultivation of crops, I have argued that weddings have their initial creative forces in the cultivation of cereals. Root crops, you'll recall, are reproduced asexually by beheading the head and replanting it. Cereals are done sexually, so the whole wedding is a sort of an allegory of that sexual reproduction of plants. The corollary of this thesis is that wedding rituals should be of less importance in the Australia-Pacific region where root crops predominate. Such indeed is the case, and something that Hocart noted long ago when he argued that a wedding ritual is a royal ritual that is spread all the way down to the lower classes, a wedding ritual is a royal ritual that is spread to the lower classes, but not all the way down. It's interesting, among the Australian Aborigines, weddings were virtually non-existent. And it seems to me no accident that theories of kinship and marriage, Levi-Strauss is a classic example, begin with Aboriginal kinship, not with Bastar kinship, which is all about weddings. India, for its part, is a classic illustration of Hocart's thesis. Lakshmi is a divine queen, one of the three great goddesses of the Hindu pantheon, along with Parvati and Saraswati. These are conceived of as sisters with three different functions. Lakshmi as the daughter goddess, Parvati as the mother goddess, and Saraswati as goddess of music and wisdom. Daughter as bride is a time of great sorrow for the bride's parents. For them it is like a funeral, but for the groom's side it is precisely the opposite. The two key parts of the Bastar wedding, the anointing and the tying and untying, are found in all life cycles, which lead me to make my Goethe-like proposition that everything is a wedding in Bastar. This, of course, includes the rice harvest, and we've seen that Guru Maharaj used the image of rice as Lakshmi to ruminate on the meaning of wealth and happiness via the story of the lotus, the elephant, the mango, and the golden bride. This rice-centric, female-centric, egalitarian conception of wealth and happiness that values female progeny over male and good health and sufficient food over other forms of material wealth calls into question the wheat-centric, male-centric, unequal conceptions of wealth and happiness that rule the world today. The epic provides no answers, but many questions and much food for thought. The summer cycle of the lotus that I first saw bloom 6 weeks ago has come to an end, and so have my lectures. Feeling it.